And when you look at the overall cord-cutting situation in the US and, audience erosion from linear TV, advertisers do want video inventory to place their ads against, and YouTube is, one of the better areas that you can put those ads if you want a large audience and targeting capabilities.
Hey gang, it's Tuesday, May 4th. Eric and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I'm Marcus, and I'm joined today by our senior forecasting analyst. It's Eric Haggstrom.
Thanks for having me.
Hey buddy, thanks for joining. Today's fact: Hershey's Kisses are named after the kissing sound the machine makes when it deposits the chocolate onto the conveyor belt. That would be a lot to listen to every day.
To be fair, they're lucky it makes a kissing sound and not something else.
I know, I guess so. That's true. Did you guys know that? I didn't know that. I always thought it was something to do with Valentine's. Hershey's Kisses, first introduced and produced back in 1907. For the first 14 years of their existence, each single kiss was individually wrapped by hand. No thank you for a job. How are things going over there, Marcus? Oh, you've managed to wrap 6 this week. What a disaster. Before machines, the hell were we doing? Today's topic: how Google looked in Q1. So, we're talking about Google and how they did in Q1 pretty well, in summary. But let's go through some of their top line numbers. Let's start with Alphabet, who owns the company. $55 billion in Alphabet revenue for Q1. Yes, $55 billion in Q1 for Alphabet. That's nearly what it made in Q4. Up 35% year on year and 3 times the growth that they saw in Q1. So the parent company crushed it. And as to be expected, the rest of the company did as well. Google advertising, let's talk about them for a second. They represent just over 80% of Alphabet's total revenue, always has. But tick down, it's now hovering around 80%, will probably stay there for a while. $45 billion in Q1, again, 3 times the growth they saw Q1 of last year. Remarkable. Within Google advertising, within that $45 billion, we have 3 things: search and other, over 70%. Google Network, which me and Eric were just talking about. It seems like they've renamed Google Network members' properties to Google Network. So that's what that is. 15%. And YouTube, almost 15%. Search, they made $32 billion, same as Q4. Network made $7 billion, YouTube made $6. Growth-wise, search was up 30, network was up 30, and YouTube was up nearly 50% year on year. Eric, Google credited, quote-unquote, elevated consumer activity online for its results. What do you credit?
Exactly that. When we look at what happened last year, obviously the pandemic changed a lot. But the big picture change as it relates to Google is that people both spent more time and more money online. They spent more time going on things like YouTube, and they also spent more money. So they spent more on Amazon, they spent more on Walmart, they spent more on DoorDash, they spent more on basically everything you could possibly imagine online. And you had this major shift, and that's a major tailwind for Google because ultimately, I don't want to say they're taking a cut, but their revenues are incredibly tied to the broader online economy. So the online economy grew. And this is something, too, that is really counterintuitive. When you think of advertising in the middle of a recession, it should go down. It's correlated with the economy. But when you talk about Google, Facebook, a lot of these other digital ad sellers, their revenues are a lot more tied to the overall digital economy rather than the overall economy. And that has been a huge driver for growth, like we saw in Q1 at Google.
Because last year wasn't just a recession, it was also the pandemic, right? And so Google executives, they were saying that they attributed some of the growth in search specifically to the pandemic. People looking for information about the coronavirus, searches for local businesses, as well as you mentioned, people buying everything pretty much, or a lot more stuff online. What numbers stood out to you the most, Eric, and why from these earnings?
Well, let's talk about just the scale of this.
Yeah.
On a gross worldwide basis, Google's advertising revenues this past quarter were a little under $45 billion, up from a little under $34 billion a year prior. So they added over $10 billion. It's actually almost $11 billion in ad revenues year on year, which
makes no sense.
Yeah. And that's in a single quarter. When we start talking about a lot of the competitors to Google and the overall digital ad market, $1 billion annually is a lot of money. They added 11 in a quarter. So they're just playing on a different scale than everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they made $147 billion in Google advertising last year, and they basically made a third of that in Q1 of this year alone. So that's Google advertising. Top line, what interested you the most from Google Search, Google Network, or YouTube? What really stood out to you?
Well, you look at these growth rates, 30% year on year for Google Search, almost 50% year on year for YouTube, 30% year on year for Google Network members, which is actually one of the fastest growth rates they've shown in recent years for the network side. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about 30% growth year on year for Google Search, again, the scale of that is just enormous. They went from $24.5 billion in Q1 of 2020 to just under $32 billion this past quarter, which when you say that something's growing at 30% and it's a market leader, a giant company like that, that's just, it's otherworldly. And it makes sense why this is happening, because people are searching more online, they're buying more online, and a lot of this is flowing through Google, because if you're a brand who's selling online, you want to make sure that people know that you're out there. And Google Search is a very, it's the best area really to let people know who are specifically searching for your product or service.
Yeah. How do you look at YouTube's numbers? Because 4 billion last Q1, 6 billion this Q1, so practically 50% growth year on year. However, their share of the total, 12% of Google advertising's total, last Q1, 13% this Q1. So the share's not going up drastically, it's ticking up slowly. You expecting that to actually, the share of what Google advertising makes coming through YouTube to grow faster, or is that pretty impressive regardless?
It's impressive regardless. Video in general has been a major growth area the past couple of years, and the past year specifically, it overperformed the market by quite a bit. So when we look at other players in video, whether it's Hulu, Roku, Pluto, Tubi, Peacock, you can go on and on and on, everyone's been showing very, very strong growth. The difference between YouTube and these other guys is that they're just quite a bit larger. Now it's a different product. We're talking about user-generated content on YouTube compared to professionally produced content on Hulu. YouTube's worldwide, whereas a lot of these other companies are, just in the US, but the scale is just completely different. And last week Comcast reported their earnings, and they talked about Peacock, and since launch they had over 1 billion hours viewed on Peacock. Well, YouTube has 1 billion hours viewed every day.
Right.
So in the roughly year that Peacock's been around, they've had about as much viewership as YouTube receives every day, basically. So yeah, and when you look at the overall cord-cutting situation in the US and, audience erosion from linear TV, advertisers do want video inventory to place their ads against, and YouTube is, one of the better areas that you can put those ads if you want a large audience and targeting capabilities.
Circling back to search for a quick second, Trip Mickle of the Wall Street Journal noted that the digital spending surge has helped Google continue to deliver sales growth even as its share of the American search advertising market slips. The company's market share of search last year fell to 57% from 61% a year earlier, while rival Amazon.com increased its share to 19% from 13%. So in the last 2 years, it went Amazon 13 to 19, and so up, and then Google 61 to 57, so down. He's citing our numbers here. Concerning for Google at all with their share decreasing 4 points in the last year or so? And where are those search ad revenue shares heading?
Yeah, so let's talk about what's actually happening. So, and our definitions around search specifically, because I think that's actually really important. So when most people think about search, and they think about horizontal search engines, Google, Bing, Yahoo, that sort of thing. I get a search bar, I can type whatever I want into it, whether, how tall is Tom Cruise, what are the best raincoats for men, you can go on and on and on.
Good questions.
Oh, exactly. But Google isn't making money off of me searching for how tall is Tom Cruise. At least I don't think so. Maybe someone's buying those keywords, right? What they're making money off of is specifically, monetizable searches. So best raincoats for men, car insurance, New York City, that sort of thing. And a number of companies, namely Amazon, though, has basically, I shouldn't say they realize this, they know this. There's a significant amount of search traffic for specific products going through their site, and they've been able to monetize that at a very, very high rate. basically, if I'm an advertiser and I'm buying through Amazon, I am as close to the consumer purchase as possible, which is a fantastic place to be. Mm-hmm. If I'm selling raincoats and I start buying keywords on Amazon.com for men's raincoats or using their various ad products, I'm incredibly close to the sale and I'm reaching people as they are actively searching for a product and likely going to buy one very soon. Google, is great in many ways, but you're just another step away. And when we talk about other companies who are gaining share in the market, the one that actually really stands out to me is Walmart, of all people. So, scrappy little Walmart, right? It's a tiny, tiny company, but they've been able to grow their digital ad revenues at a massive rate. And we're actually expecting them to take in about 1% of the overall search market this year, up from, practically zero a few years ago, which is huge. And 1% of the overall search market this year will be just about $1 billion in the US. And there's other companies in the space who are doing this as well. Instacart is a great example. And also Apple's App Store, iOS App Store is doing this as well, where they know that they have a lot of search traffic coming through for specific apps. What's the best weather app, or, searches for Snapchat or TikTok. And people are buying those keywords to try and get in front of people as they are searching for specific apps as well. Mm-hmm. So it's not that Google's performing poorly by any means. They were a little bit more exposed to travel, which was a vertical that did horribly last year, of course, but the market's just growing in a lot of ways.
So a lot of these line items, it's a similar story. Let's take Google Search another, for example, 9% growth in Q1 2020, and then going quarter on quarter from there on, it went from 9% in Q1, -10, 7, 17, 30. Same with the other line items. YouTube, 34% pre-pandemic Q1 2020, then 6, 32, 46, 49% growth at each quarter, and that's year-on-year numbers. So you can argue that they rebounded by Q3 and then have just continued to ascend from there. Google's ad revenue in Q2 2020 was down 2%. If we can remember when that happened, that was 2% year-on-year. Since then, quarter on quarter, it's gone 10%, 20%, 30% each quarter. Eric, where do we expect Google to be at the end of this year? I mean, it's so remarkable what they've done. And you mentioned travel. They've done all of this without a true travel rebound as well.
Yeah. And this is a bit of a complicated question in a number of ways. But ultimately, when you talk about what happened last year, certain advertisers pulled budgets in late March, so affecting Q1. The bottom was in April and May of last year, and things began to recover from then. Yep. Let's talk about seasonality of specific verticals for a second. The travel industry spends most of their advertising budget in Q2 and Q3. Okay. So in advance of summer travel and in advance of the holiday season. And a lot of that recovery in Google Search's overall business came from non-travel verticals. So specifically actually e-commerce, gaming, and a few others were the big ones. And CPG too. I don't want to forget CPG. What we're expecting will happen this year is that vaccinations in the US are going, ahead of schedule really. And that there will be a boom in travel and that a slight return to normal at some point later on in the year, maybe in the late summer, early fall timeframe. But when you start talking about how people buy travel, they book these trips well in advance. So the actual bookings are going to happen in Q2 like normal, and Q3 like normal. So these companies, your Expedias, your Bookings.com, the airlines companies, they're likely going to resume most of their ad spending and have a pretty strong recovery. Maybe not to 100%, but pretty well in Q2. Okay. Now, when you start lapping those weak comps in Q2 of 2020, growth is going to be absurd in this quarter. We saw 30% growth in Google Search in Q1. That year-over-year growth is going to be a lot higher in Q2. And then when we start lapping these strong quarters in Q3 and Q4 of 2020, growth will decelerate to, a more normal rate. And this is what Google has been guiding towards as well. Okay. But you were telling me we were on the pretty high end, pretty aggressive end in terms of what we thought Google was going to do in Q1. And we actually were pretty spot on in terms of predictions. What are we expecting from them this year as a whole? We're expecting that overall gross Google Search and other ad revenue will grow about 25% this year. Okay. For the full year. Right. YouTube will likely grow a little under 40% for the full year. And then the network members are likely going to grow around 20%. Okay. Got it. So, strong growth across the board. And this is a significant rebound compared to last year where search was, on a worldwide basis, on a gross basis, was around 6%. It was when you look at the US specifically, it was actually a little bit lower, most likely. We think it grew somewhere around 2.5%. International performed a little bit better in some markets, and there's a few other modeling reasons onto that.
Yeah, two other line items I want to talk about. One is net income, up 162% year on year, reaching $18 billion. Last Q1, it was up 3% at $7 billion, and now is up 162% to $18 billion. 18 billion should be a half year number, because $17 billion in net income for Google H1 2019, $18 billion in H2 2019, $14 billion in H1 2020, and then $18 billion in a single quarter, Q1 2021. The other line item I want to talk about is cloud computing. Still a very distant third, but cloud computing, its revenue did grow nearly 50% in that space. As Mr. Mickle of the Wall Street Journal notes, quote, the speed bumps from privacy aren't expected to slow Alphabet's money-making machine. The company's search engine has a lock on 92% of worldwide traffic. Its Maps offerings have an 89% share of navigation, and YouTube accounts for 73% of the online video world, close quote. So that's all we've got time for the first half. It's, of course, time for the halftime report. It's where we summarize the key takeaways from the lead story in 30 seconds before in other news in the second half of the show. So, Eric, what are your key takeaways from the first half?
Key takeaways are that Google is growing basically according to plan. We've seen a full recovery in the digital ad market. And as we look towards the rest of the year, we are expecting a return of travel ad spend, which, ultimately will kind of normalize some of the growth rates that we're seeing at Google.
Right, that's all we've got time for the lead story. It's time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, VTEX. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast, flexible, and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. You can go to vtex.com/eMarketer to learn more. All right, folks, we are back. It's time now for In Other News. Today, what share of brands are expected to spend more on marketing? Google is in hot water again. And we check in on the cookie doomsday clock. Story 1. 60% of brands are expected to spend more on marketing this year, writes Ray Schultz of Media Post 60. 20% of brands will spend less, 20% will spend the same, according to Zogby Analytics. Eric, what do our numbers tell us about what to expect from an ad recovery in 2021?
Yeah, so ultimately we are expecting a pretty significant rebound in the overall ad market, with about 18% growth in overall media ad spend compared to 0% last year. And for digital specifically, we're expecting about a 25% growth rate this year compared to about 15% last year. So a pretty strong reacceleration, especially across the overall ad market. But digital actually performed very well last year, and we expect it to perform quite a bit better this year.
Yeah, a few things that stood out to me with these numbers. Digital ad spending, as you said, this year's 26% bounce back. Then growth lives in the low double digits going forward. So that's where that will sit. And then for total, as you mentioned, this year's 18%, next year's 11%, and then 2023's 9% will all be higher than anything we've seen in like the past decade, apart from 2018.
And a lot of that's, mainly due to growth in digital.
I was going to say, yeah, thank you, digital.
Yeah, and there's a million reasons for this, but the big thing is that consumers, as a result of the pandemic, spent more time online last year and spent more money online last year, and we expect that trend will continue and those gains will not be clawed back. And as consumers spend more time online and as they spend more money online, more advertising will happen online. Yep.
Those total ad spending growth rates will stay above pre-pandemic 7% of 2019 until 2025. So they're going to stay up there. Story 2. As Insider Intelligence analyst Nina Getson writes, quote, Google is in hot water again after it unwittingly confirmed suspicions that it used its dominant position in the display ad market to give preference to itself and its clients in a program known as Project Bernanke. The documents show that Project Bernanke used data that Google gathered from the ad exchange to help it get the best possible deals for itself and its clients. Because Google knew exactly how much ads were selling for, it could bid the bare minimum amount it knew was needed to win the bid. The documents show that Google expected Project Bernanke to generate $230 million in revenues in 2013, accounted for 9% of Google's net US display ad revenues for the year, which we estimate were $2.7 billion. Of that, $1.9 billion came from Google's network members business, the part that is currently under antitrust scrutiny, close quotes. Eric, how much will this matter?
I mean, I'm of the opinion that Google's display business is not a monopoly. So, I mean, it's definitely dominant in some parts of the market, and there's some anti-competitive issues like what we saw with this, but I don't think it matters that much. It's anti-competitive for sure, but we'll see. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't really know what the law is in this space.
Mm-hmm. Story 3. Andrew Bluestein of Adweek notes that, quote, advertisers' questions persist as Google opens flocks to external trials. Mr. Bluestein writes that the cookie doomsday clock is 9 months away from striking midnight. According to Adweek's survey, 2/3 of respondents don't believe Google's moves mark the end of mass market retargeting, but slightly more than 2/3 think the changes will negatively impact the ad tech ecosystem, with Chrome having the largest browser market share of around 65% and other browsers like Firefox and Safari staunchly anti-tracking. There's not much for the ad industry to do other than test and hope for the best. As one respondent to Adweek's survey put it, Google says jump, you ask how high? Eric, what are your thoughts on this part of the article, and what do you make of where the ad industry is with regards to preparing for the end of the cookie?
Well, this is a complicated subject in many ways, but what I do want to point out is that a lot of the digital ad market now does not rely directly on cookies. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't rely indirectly, something like attribution or measurement or some of the targeting, but a lot of the actual advertising now happens in cookieless environments, specifically in-app advertising, whether it's something happening on Facebook or CTV. Not to suggest that cookies don't play a role in the system, but they've become a little bit less important overall as the system has grown. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and ultimately, we are seeing a good amount of growth in the industry as well around alternative IDs to replace the cookie. So Unified ID 2.0 is a great example of that. And there are a number of competing, IDs as well.
Mm-hmm. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Marcus.
Of course, sir. Thank you to everyone listening. We'll see you guys tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I'm not a fan of the Hershey's Kiss. I don't want to bash them. I'm a Cadbury's boy.